Hello, hello everyone, and welcome to the HOPA webinar. It is 3 o'clock, but we are going to be waiting a couple of minutes for people to join. Again, welcome everybody. We are waiting just a minute or two for people to join, and then we will start the webinar. Hello, everyone. I think we're going to start the webinar. Welcome to the HOPA webinar titled Critical Conversations, Navigating Drug Shortages and Empowering Oncology Pharmacists. I will be your moderator. My name is Saul Achenza, and I'm a Hematology Oncology Clinical Pharmacy Specialist at Advocate Health Midwest. I'm also a HOPA board member, and I have been asked, and I'm very excited to moderate this apparently popular topic. As of this morning, we have a number of attendees registered as 677. So we have 6 panelists in our webinar. Most of them are HOPA representatives. I am particularly thrilled to have panelists also from the Association of Community Cancer Centers, as well as the Association of Veterans Affairs Hematology Oncology. So I may refer to them as ACCC and AVAHO. So thank you so much for partnering with us. This is a very unique opportunity for a virtual roundtable discussion with pointed questions that allow for a number of different perspectives from our panelists. So I just want to give some housekeeping information, and that is to better manage our questions. We are going to utilize the question and answer function. So the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen, most likely, it will allow attendees to type questions within that box. Another feature associated with the Q&A box is that you can upvote questions, which means click on the icon that looks like a thumbs up. This pushes that question up to the top. This is very handy, especially if you see a question that's very similar to yours. You can use the upvote function. These questions will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. Most likely, we won't be able to address all of those questions. So at the end of the webinar, our HOPA staff will help us compile these questions and we'll put replies to them. This document will then be posted in the HOPA website, and we will also work with the staff for ACCC and AVAHO in order to disseminate that same document to those organizations. So at this point, I would like to introduce our panelists. So I have the pleasure of introducing 6 panelists, and I would like the panelists to give the audience a wave when I introduce you. So my first panelist is Mata Mudia. So Mata is a hematology oncology clinical pharmacy specialist. She's in Inova Health Systems, and she is our representative from ACCC. Natalie Osagi. So Natalie is a hematology oncology clinical pharmacy specialist from Veterans Affairs. She is our AVAHO representative, and her practice also includes lung cancer patients. Jeff Piltz. So Jeff is an assistant director at the Pharmacy of Medication Safety and Drug Policy at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. He's a HOPA representative, and he's also an author of an article on HOPA drug shortage surveys, which was recently published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, Oncology Practice in 2022. Sarah Hudson DeSalle. Sarah is a pharmacy manager of medication assistance programs and reimbursement services at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, and she is a HOPA representative, and she is also an author of that same article on HOPA drug shortage survey. Peter Stussy. So Peter is a hematology oncology clinical pharmacy specialist. He's also my coworker at the Advocate Health Midwest. He is a HOPA representative, and he oversees our drug shortages in our organization. And Sarah Hayward. So Sarah is a pharmacy specialist in Gyn-Onc at the Stevenson Cancer Center at the University of Oklahoma, and she is a HOPA representative. So those are our panelists. Before we get started, I would like to just say a few words about drug shortages. I was given an article that was published earlier this month in which it stated that ASHP's latest data shows that drug shortages hit a 10-year high in the first quarter of 2023. So this includes new drug shortages as well as ongoing unresolved shortages. So in that first quarter of 2023, there were 47 new drugs that went into shortage. So when you look at chemotherapy drugs as one of the drug classes, chemotherapy drugs actually was one of the top 5 drug classes within those shortages. So very apparent in our oncology setting. Next, I want to give a few aspects of drug shortages. First of all, looking at the causes of drug shortages. So this is multifactorial. There are many possible causes. One, to begin with, is the low profit margins in generic drugs that make them more susceptible to drug shortages. The lack of incentives for manufacturers to produce these less profitable drugs make them more susceptible. Another cause is over-reliance on foreign manufacturers. So over the past 2 decades, it has become apparent that we've become more dependent on a global pharmaceutical supply chain. And this includes even the active pharmaceutical ingredients from abroad. This really hit home when during the pandemic, India had imposed a ban on exported medications. Another cause is regulatory challenges. So as we have regulatory safeguards, it leads to possibly manufacturers shutting down or delaying in manufacturing processes. Market demand and supply mismatch. So as we have mismatches in demand and supply, it's difficult for those manufacturers to actually recover from that while still maintaining those regulatory standards. And lastly, natural disasters and global events. So some of you can maybe recall the Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico, in which there was a loss of their power grid. And about a month later, there was a shortage of normal saline fluids. So those are some of the possible causes of drug shortages. Now we can go into the effects or implications of drug shortage. So one is, of course, compromised patient care. There could be treatment delays in the timing of chemotherapy, or there could be disruptions in the dose or regimen alterations. Patients may have to transfer to other institutions where the drug is more available. And even, unfortunately, some patients may have to miss doses of chemotherapy. There's also increased health costs. So I mentioned that HOPA survey. Some of the respondents had reported that 25% or more increase in the cost as they try and acquire drug from the gray market. And then there's an increase in healthcare provider burden. That same HOPA survey, there were 29 respondents that had stated that there was at least 1,000 or more impersonal hours that were dedicated to drug shortage. And of those respondents, only 92% of them actually received any additional FTE hours. And we can't forget, as far as implications to drug shortage, that it causes patient anxiety and distress. There's ethical and moral dilemmas. And also this can lead to medication errors. As we use alternative agents, we have dose conversions, maybe from IV to PO. Also, we have our electronic medical records that maybe have to be immediately converted. And unfortunately, that may lead to medication errors. And then there may be effects on clinical trials. And lastly, I just would like to mention some of the trends and patterns in drug shortages. So we have a lack in transparency and communication, and I hope through this webinar that we can see some recommendations as far as how we can make that better. We touched on the generic medications being more susceptible to shortages. Also that oncology medications specifically have a higher frequency of shortages. Single source manufacturing, that also makes drugs more susceptible to drug shortages, as well as the global supply chain that we talked about and regulatory standards. So now let's turn to our panelists and ask some pointed questions. What I will do is I will have one of the panelists initially answer the question and then give others a chance to reply. But before starting, I just want to mention that there's also a set time for each of our questions. So in order to get through all the questions, we may need to enforce some time limits. So our first topic is really the role of the oncology pharmacist in drug shortage management, very much a pivotal role. So looking at the proactive planning and the preparedness, I'm going to pose this question first to Mata. And the question is, how can oncology pharmacists proactively plan and prepare for potential drug shortages?
Thank you, Sol, for the introduction and for a very thorough coverage so far. We are at an unprecedented time after the COVID-19 pandemic where health systems are experiencing short staff conditions across many disciplines. With the increase in the frequency of shortages and pharmacy staff being pulled into many directions, I find myself in these situations wearing hats and functions that ClinSpecs haven't traditionally filled before. Shortage cases where I've been most successful at being proactive have been where I've been empowered as a clinical specialist to have a close relationship with our buyers and to be able to perform basic informatic pharmacy duties, such as pulling my own reports. I keep my ears to the ground by keeping in regular contact with ClinSpec colleagues around the nation. Given the lack of transparency with manufacturer updates on backorder lists in terms of the nature and the outlook of the backorder, I often find out from other regions of the country where a true shortage might be spiking up or upcoming before it hits our region. I have then approached our buyers who have a lot to keep up with these days. And so in some cases, they will say, you know, I noticed the back order the other day. However, I hadn't thought much of it yet, but we have reports now from cancer centers from other regions in the country where it's in a worse situation. So then I set up an internal meeting with the pharmacy team to look at our storage situation and our drug utility, and quickly we're able to up order as much as feasible to cushion ourselves for the upcoming shortage battle ahead. In terms of informatics, I've been successful at keeping close contact with our buyers for how many weeks of supply we have ahead of the restriction criteria being needed. And so, for example, to give a recent example, about like 2 weeks before we needed to address our 5FU shortage at our site, I ran a report to find out, you know, what percentage of our 5FU usage comprises our 5FU boluses, what percentages are like colorectal patients on FOLFOX, things like that to gauge what type of restriction criteria needs to be initially drafted. So at our site, we try to draft restriction criteria a couple of weeks before we need it. Sometimes we toss those decks, but most of the time we're tremendously you know, happy that we got ahead of the issue.
Thank you. Are there other panelists that would like to answer that question of preparedness and readiness? Okay, we will go on to the next question. And Jeff, I'm going to pose this to you. What strategies or processes can be implemented to ensure readiness?
Yes, thanks, Sol. And Mata did a great job talking about some of the clinical pieces. Certainly that element of being proactive is a great way to set yourself up for success. I think I'd speak for everyone on the call that shortages are extremely frustrating. It's one extra piece or challenge that we face as healthcare providers in the current state. So if you have a good process or good foundation for how to manage any drug shortage, whether that be oncology products or another, it really will make it a little bit less painful to try to come up with a mitigation strategy. And then also keeping track of what mitigation strategies have worked well for your institution. There's not necessarily a one size fits all, although there's certain definitely trends that fit into things that work well at most places, best practices, but things that you can tailor to your site that have worked well in the past, maybe you can dust off and implement during a new shortage, especially as some of these agents will be cyclical shortages. They will come into shortage several times, either within the same year or in the future. Part of that foundation is having a drug shortage group or group of individuals that can individually address whatever the problem may be, and then be able to escalate that as required based on the intensity of the shortage. So here at Ohio State, we have a drug shortage committee. That group is multidisciplinary. It's led by pharmacy, but basically has one representative from every clinical disease state as well as operational site or area that can collaborate together to make a decision really on the spot. They also have authority to supersede P&T and bring in things, say, non-formulary or make IT expedited changes. Of course, nowadays in technology, it basically has a hand in everything. So almost any change with a drug shortage may impact some sort of piece of technology, a smart pump, EHR, or some other device. And so it's important to keep those in mind when making some of your decisions around what is the best plan as an alternative. Our institution has also tried to do a lot of creative things within pharmacy or the supply chain level to try to minimize that impact on frontline providers. So trying to do things upstream. That could be alternative sourcing, using different dispensing methods, or changing products that we're using within pharmacy. We may not get to the level of needing to implement clinical restrictions later on, but certainly that's kind of our last line of defense that we can go to and turn to if things get to be that bad in terms of our inventory. And then certainly also having a plan for if you get to one of those last ditch scenarios, worst case scenarios, how do you go about making those tough decisions? So it may be an ethics standing committee that you have at your institution, or even just a small group that you can pull together ad hoc as a scarce resource committee, but making decisions then around which patients or which disease states maybe get that remaining drug, and what are the alternatives that are going to be used for those other groups. Typically, that also may include someone, if you have like a chief medical officer, a CEO, or your other C-suite members, chief pharmacy officers, and other individuals that can really bring that in. So division leaders, having that open communication leading up to that shortage before you get to that point is really critical, so they can start planning for it in advance as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. I think we've hit on a lot of things already. My next question is going to be more of a pointed question, and that is with inventory management and strategies to optimize the resource allocations. So Peter, I'm going to pose this to you. What are some effective inventory management strategies that oncology pharmacists can employ to optimize resource allocations and minimize disruption to patient care?
Thanks, Sol. Well, as previously mentioned by Mata, if you have some extra space around in your hazardous drug rooms and can stock as much inventory as possible on some of these repeat offenders especially. Jeff very clearly pointed out that some of these are cyclical. You know they're going to pop back up again. So on those targeted agents, you want to make sure that you're keeping that extra supply on hand if your inventory space can handle it, as well as if your bottom line can handle it. Many of these drugs tend to be on the cheaper end, so hopefully as an organization, you're able to stock at least some extra drug for when none is available. As mentioned as well, trying to recognize and preempt as much as possible that it's coming. Mata had a great example of networking previously already that she uses, but also making sure you have those contacts with your wholesalers as well as with manufacturers, and having those reps available to contact directly, get an idea of the best information they have, which isn't always the best information, unfortunately, but it's what they can share, and it's something. Trying to plan out from there. Okay, well, we're expecting releases in a week. How much do we have to be concerned? We have to be able to jump on those releases when they do come. If you have a chance for multiple contracts with multiple wholesalers, having a secondary wholesaler where if one's out, maybe you can jump to that next one. I know some smaller organizations that's just not available. I work for a very large health system, so we have multiple secondary wholesalers throughout our system that we're able to tap at different times, and sometimes some will have some in stock and some won't. It really depends on your organization on if you're able to take advantage of that or not. Other inventory strategies I've seen quite a bit, especially with the current shortages that are happening, are taking advantage of the work of our HOPA colleagues and endorsement from NCCN and ASCO on dose rounding. Many sites, as part of their strategies, have had a 10% dose rounding on certain meds based off of the work in that white paper. So that is another one where you can hopefully at least give drug to as many patients as possible in that particular situation. Also rounding to the closest vial size on single dosed vials as well, in order to try to help save inventory and not waste any inventory at the end of your day as well. So limiting that waste. If you can, try to schedule as many patients as possible if they're single dose vials on the same day. So again, you're eliminating that waste that's happening. Just really quick, our organization is also using ethics in a lot of our decision making, and we currently utilize an ethical standard set forth by the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care that they developed for drug shortages in March of 2012. I don't know if others have heard of that one, but that is our framework for what we're using to determine any restriction criteria we've had to implement.
Wonderful. Many strategies for inventory management. Thank you, Peter. The next subject that I'm going to be hitting on is therapeutic substitution. So considerations of alternative agents. Natalie, how can oncology pharmacists collaborate with healthcare teams to ensure that the best possible treatment options are for patients?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. One of the things that I can say about this is that usually with cisplatin and carboplatin, if we don't have cisplatin, we go to carbo. If we don't have carbo, we try cisplatin in patients who can, maybe tolerate them. But unfortunately, at this present time, both of them, we can't get a hold of them in most places. So what we are having to do in my facility is kind of like go back to the drawing board and say, okay, it may not be a platinum agent, but what are medications in other classes that may be feasible for us to use? We in my facility have tried to take a look at that. It hasn't really been feasible in like the non-metastatic setting of lung cancer. So we are having to prioritize medications for those patients. But for the metastatic setting, we've been able to come out with some options that we may be able to fall back into if we're like completely out of medications to use, like platinum agents to use. So having a committee or a work group is very vital. This includes all stakeholders. So in such a situation where you have Surg-Onc, Rad-Onc, Med-Onc, you have nursing, you have the PharmDs, you have the steroid compounders. It's a one-stop shop to like make decisions on what could be done. So it doesn't just involve maybe like having to go to therapeutic auctions. It may be like, okay, this patient who we probably could have been able to treat with medication may be able to get radiation. Or a patient who we were planning peri-operative regimen for may not really have to get the neoadjuvant aspect of it. And surgery may just say, okay, we're going to be able to take this into surgery. So those are all some of the other situations that we looked at. Then from the oncology pharmacy perspectives, that's really a situation or a position for your voice to be heard. And just generally searching through literatures, looking at the guidelines, having a conversation with your providers. I'm fortunate to have a very good relationship with the people I work with. I have them on speed dial. So if any idea hits me, I can just like completely like, you know, message them to say, hey, can you take a look at this, or have you seen this, or what would you do if such a situation arises? So we've been doing that, communicating. So frequent communication is very, very important. If you don't have like a group set up, just set up that group, and not just talking about it, but it's nice to like set up kind of like an SOP so that you can distribute it around, so that when things are getting done, nobody's out of the loop and everybody's on the same page. You know, if you have a certain allocation of medication, set the priority level, like, okay, if we have 75%, who are the patients who are going to be our priority? If we have 50%, who are going to be our priority? So this is actually an avenue for the clinical on-PharmD to actually play a very great role. And also just communicating to say, okay, these are the other meds that we have in stock that may be feasible, does help. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. We just have one more question in this section. This goes to Sarah. There's two Sarahs. So this is Sarah Hudson DeSalle. How can oncology pharmacists collaborate with healthcare providers and suppliers to navigate drug shortages and maintain continuity of care, which we've kind of touched on?
Yeah, so thank you, Saul. And I was just going to say, I think some of our previous panelists have already touched on some really great aspects of this communication, and really one of the big pieces, communication, you know, frequent communication, being totally transparent with your clinical providers, your wholesalers, your drug suppliers, but then also your payers too. You need to make sure that everyone knows about the struggles that you're having. What are the guidelines that are available? Providing those guidelines. ASCO has some disease-specific guidelines around clinical restrictions or dose rounding or changes in therapeutic options. Utilizing that information, being transparent, getting the information out, and being timely with that information is always helps to have the best success moving forward. It's a frustrating landscape of being, for sure, and I think that we're kind of all in this together. So.
Thank you, Sarah. The next question has to do with more of our collaborative approaches. And again, we've kind of touched on it, but this goes to Jeff. What strategies can oncology pharmacists employ to establish and maintain partnerships with alternative suppliers and manufacturers?
And Peter did a great job already describing some of those actions that we can take at the supply chain level and within our pharmacy purchasing departments. I'll just expound on that a little bit. Early on in the shortage, typically these companies will implement a protective allocation. So if you're fortunate enough to have those multiple sources already built out, so whether that be multiple wholesaler contracts or having wholesaler, maybe alternative distribution or some sort of short dated product purchasing portal, you can maybe leverage those to get a fraction of your historical percentage and kind of set you up for maybe a longer period before you have to take some of the more critical actions for mitigation. One of the things to remember, though, is that's that fraction of historical percentage. So if you don't have any historical purchases on that account, you may be denied access to that product or have to wait until everything else has been spoken for and your orders may be reduced to a smaller number they would have otherwise. So it's a fine balance because there's usually GPO limitations and other contractual obligations that your health system will have, especially with your primary contracts, that there's a certain percentage or certain dollar spend that has to come from those. You also have to keep in track of what are your direct contracts with certain manufacturers where you're buying either directly or using a direct contract price through a wholesaler. So there may be impacts with that. You may also need to get your 340B team involved to keep just compliant in that realm if you're also participating in that savings program. But it may be important then, if you can have the facilities to be able to do so, to buy certain items on different accounts or maybe use different sites to buy, and then you can do an inter-system transfer between your different infusion locations as well as your inpatient to outpatient. Vendor relationships are extremely important, but it's also remember, especially if you're a state or government organization, it takes a very long time to set up those vendor agreements. So you may want to be proactive and set those up before you run into the shortage so that doesn't delay you taking action on those alternative accounts. And then when you are in a period of shortage, if the wholesalers are stocked out, you still have that option to contact your rep and having the manufacturer maybe potentially set up a direct allocation or direct shipment. You can also offer, if your site uses a substantial amount, do a bulk buy and say, hey, you know, if this is somehow more palatable, or if we can get a decent price on some of those higher expensive alternatives, different NDCs that may have a exorbitantly high price during the shortage, maybe you can knock some of that off if you're desperate. I do reiterate, though, stay away from the gray market if at all possible. I know we are sometimes desperate to help our patients, but that just encourages that bad behavior. And I know our institution as a principle and policy does not actually engage in those organizations.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very helpful information. The next question is one that's interesting to me, and this is open for all the panelists to reply, and that is leveraging technology and data analysis. So the question is, are any of you on this panel using innovative approaches or technologies to proactively monitor, predict, or address drug shortages?
I wouldn't call it innovative, but we're using some of the same strategies that Mata previously mentioned of networking primarily. Unfortunately, when a manufacturer or somebody is having a supply issue, they don't like telling everybody that very much, that it's bad for their business. So oftentimes it's, you know, we get hints and ideas from different other people we know around the country that's helping us understand that, hey, this is starting to get a little tighter. Or else, you know, even from our own staff, you know, we just like, hey, you know, I'm seeing the numbers decreasing on this and it's not being restocked at the wholesaler. So not really innovative strategies at all. But those are some of the things, some of the less innovative and more just person-to-person ones that we've been using.
When you're watching for shortages, what do people use as resources? Natalie.
So I was going to say there was actually a great notification. ASHP has a great notification, but even to today, there was a notification that came out from Pfizer that was very proactive around the penicillin products and the shortage that they're anticipating, what is causing it, when it will anticipated to be resolved. And, you know, I think that type of behavior is what we really need to push moving forward. So Natalie, I apologize for.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what Peter said, like just the old-fashioned way. Like in my institution, we have like a par-level drug inventory where certain people have access to, and the buyer is expected to keep a certain stock. So she may not report to us that, hey, you know, I'm having difficulty, but if you have something like that in your facility, I would go there periodically and just take a look. Okay, for example, we are supposed to have 20 vials in stock, and now there's 15. What is going on? 2-3 days is not up to 20. So at that time, I could shoot a message to the buyer and say, hey, what is going on here? So that's one way of me like just keeping tab on what is going on. And then she'll probably just tell me, hey, I'm having difficulty. So once she passes that message across, then I can go online and search, hey, is there a drug shortage or anything like that on that particular medication? Yeah.
Great. Anybody else on resources?
And I'll just mention, especially for small health systems, I know it can be a pain point to try to look at specialty software options. I don't have experience with those myself, so I can't speak to the efficacy of them, but I know they can be potentially expensive. We leverage a lot of our EHR references, so we're an Epic institution. There's a number of shadow reports and different flags that we implemented so that, you know, essentially kind of creating a pre-min par level that we can flag for certain items, especially those ones that we know are going to be chronic shortage complaints or issues. We can have a certain point where it flags us to say, hey, our inventory has been dropping to a certain point. Before we hit that minimum, we can do some investigation manually and determine what next steps or if there is a true shortage.
Okay, great, very interesting. This next section is going to be analyzing a specific shortage that we're encountering right now, and that is with the cisplatin and carboplatin shortage. So I'm going to turn to Peter for the carboplatin and cisplatin shortage. It has significant impact on our cancer community, and given the wide range of cancers treated with these agents, please elaborate on the landscape of the carboplatin and cisplatin shortage and how we got there.
I'll try to keep this short. It's primarily due to Accord shutting down. The FDA went in, found violations, shut them down. They have a plant in India where they were making their carbo and cisplatin, and the other manufacturers weren't able to keep up with demand. So just to keep things moving, that's basically why we're where we're at. They're prioritizing cisplatin and 5-FU, getting back online first, carboplatin after that. So just so everyone's aware if you didn't know that information already.
Yep, and there's our foreign drug supply at work. Okay, so looking at the cisplatin and carboplatin shortage, I'm posing this question to Sarah and Natalie, being our gynecological and lung cancer experts. Could you discuss the considerations and challenges involved in selecting appropriate alternatives?
Thanks, Sol. So the challenges when we specifically talk about certain disease sites, the question is, what are the options? And in some of our disease sites, such as in gynecologic oncology and lung, the data continues to point where platinum-based therapies in certain situations are with curative intent. And we don't have a lot of other options for specifically, like we talked about, ovarian cancer. And so I think what's been really fantastic, and I can talk about this a little bit in the next section too, but SGO, so Society of Gynecologic Oncology, was very quick to come out with recommendations, alternative recommendations for individual disease sites in specific regards to these shortages. How to allocate to what, how to adjust doses, a lot of the things that we've already discussed, like dose rounding, dose reducing is possible, changing from every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, stuff like that. But also, I think another big component of it, being in an institution where we treat lots of different disease sites, is being engaged with the other providers and the other disease sites where maybe they do have an alternate that's not platinum, and making sure that everyone's working together to prioritize those patients who benefit most from a platinum-based therapy. Natalie?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did in my section of the VA was to immediately create that group of people that were involved and try to figure out what our options would be. So just like Sarah alluded to, we and some of the members have alluded to as well, we went into the mode of scheduling patients together, rounding and stuff like that. And from our panel, from what we set up, so we weren't really able to get any platinum sparing agent, like in the non-metastatic lung cancer. They all need a platinum agent. So we just kind of like, okay, these are going to be our priority patients. So we started looking at like the metastatic setting of what we could do with those patients if we ended up not having anything for them. Like platinum agents. So we thought about like immunotherapy, Nivo-EP, gem, taxane, gemcitabine. Like if you're not thinking about like just single agents, there were other single agents that we could, like technically go into for like the small cell lung cancer extensive stage. Instead of going re-challenging with the platinum doublet, if they're like, if they are 6 months or more disease-free interval, then, we could just go to like a second line agent like lobinecdectin and use that instead of re-challenging them with platinum agents, just to kind of like, save those for the people who need them. So those were actually put on paper so that everybody was aware. And, even for the people in the non-metastatic who needed the platinum agent, if we were completely out, we talked about what to do. If, taking it to ethics, like somebody had alluded to, and RAD-ONC was there, SURG-ONC was there to kind of like chime in, upfront, to be looking at patients who like they could just radiate or take into surgery.
All right, thank you, Natalie. I just want to open it up to the group too. We've heard from Sarah and Natalie in terms of selecting appropriate alternatives, and they've also touched on what those alternative regimens are. Does anybody else have anything else to add? Because we all are dealing with this cisplatin and carboplatin shortage.
So just to piggyback on Sarah and Natalie, we've kind of discussed a little bit about the important role of having a multidisciplinary work group, ethics committee to be able to address these issues. But to piggyback on Sarah, it's not just important to have folks from different disciplines. A lot of these times we only have about a week or two to really drop our utilization rapidly in these situations. And so having folks from different specialties, when we have, a breast patient, a lung patient, a gyne patient, competing for the same drug in the curative intent, for example, it's hard for our providers to have perspective when they're sitting in their silos, but when you bring them as a group together really early on to discuss who needs it most, where are there truly lack of alternative therapies, it's been really successful in my practice to be able to get those discussions going up front, to be able to really influence your prescribing practices right away.
Yeah, another thing too that I wanted to just add on real quick is that in my facility, the whole idea was we have to have like a certain number of cycles of the medication available to even get the patient started. So we don't just give one and then end up not being able to like give the second or the third. So every patient would have to have like an allocation to use before even starting. So if we didn't have that allocation, then that would be communicated back to the provider. Provider usually would just contact me and say, hey, what do we have? What can we do? Then it's my responsibility to go back, collecting data, looking at the number and stuff like that to see what we can do. So that was also one of the strategies that we have been using.
Yeah, and just something else to add, what we've been doing since we've been consenting our patients for multiple alternatives all at the same time. So they get consented for carbo or cis plus Taxol, for example, because quite honestly, when 3 weeks comes around, I have no idea what we will have on hand. It will be one of them. So providing that education to the patient up front, making sure that we're having that open conversation that this is happening. At this point in time, most of them have said, yeah, I saw it in the news, and things of that nature is just something else to kind of cut down on the paperwork. And we just, we've really very basic, keeping an Excel spreadsheet of everyone who we've spoken to, what we consented them for, where they are in their plan, what decisions were made, so that perhaps when the shortage is complete, we'll have this one place where we can go back and say, okay, who do we talk to? Who do we need to readdress, and things of that nature.
Great points being made. We're going to go on to the next section, and that is just to wrap it up before we go to our Q&A portion of the webinar. So I'm posing this to Mata, and that is, could you share specific experiences or success stories where an oncology pharmacist played a pivotal role in managing a drug shortage situation?
Thank you, Sol. I feel like we just, Sarah and Natalie just covered a lot of the typical types of success stories that I've had. But I'll broaden it up to say, I have invested the early part of my career in clinical pharmacy to get as much basic skills in informatics pharmacy as I possibly can to be efficient in pulling reports and analyzing them. And that's been really helpful to me when we come to these interdisciplinary discussions, because of the lack of information we have from the manufacturers, the wholesalers, the regulatory bodies. We're often put in these situations where we have to make critical ethical patient care decisions based on, at best, like very vague information. And so by being able to pull reports proactively, I've been able to serve best on the team as the numbers person to, come ready to discuss how many weeks supply do we have, what percentage of drug usage do we need to decrease and how fast, where are those percentage in our patient populations? If we do X, Y, and Z, for example, where do we land in a week or two, and when do we need to reassess the situation? And I've always been an advocate for a dedicated shortage working group with shortage situations that hit a critical pivotal threshold that needs close management. And I think a lot of our institutions right now around the country are there. And we've gone even beyond that. A lot of questions are coming in about ethics committees and a lot of word around many cancer centers and health systems utilizing ethics committees from before, or any new committees that they've had to form around the current shortages going on. And one of my success stories is, for example, when we were having the Raxane shortage, we formed a multidisciplinary shortage committee that met weekly. This allowed us to, as Natalie mentioned, ear tag vials for each prioritized patient that we committed to treat them for their full course of their definitive therapy. And at that time, I was working in Arizona, where we had a huge influx of snowbirds coming in seasonally, sometimes from as far as Canada. And so getting ahead of these shortages, it allowed us to actually successfully contact patients to not migrate down for the season, as their local cancer centers had Raxane for their indication, where our cancer center didn't. And so months later, we had patients, when things resolved, come and ask for me by name, these painful calls I'd made, and thank me for basically being, like a kind voice in their bad news. And so cannot emphasize how important transparency is across all disciplines and patients, and being able to get the information out to them as soon as possible of what's going on and what the situation is across the whole landscape. I think as clinical specialists, we're uniquely situated and qualified to be the voice of calm in these storms. I've had nurses, pharmacists, and physician colleagues surrender to the unsustainable moral pressure of these situations and lose their composure. And so coming to the discussion as informed as possible with a plan and numbers, I'm able to empower my team and those folks to have the right transparent conversations with patients. A lot of anxiety arises in the clinical setting, both for direct patient caregivers and for patients when the answers to the questions are, I don't know. So the more numbers we have, I think the better the conversations are with the patients as well. And I will end with saying, just never assume that other members of the pharmacy team don't need your help on shortages. I think, when we're sitting in the clinical setting, we're kind of siloed in direct patient care. And so I found myself in a position where I've been able to successfully put critical questions and words in our buyers and directors' arsenal when they're speaking to representatives from wholesalers and manufacturers to get us as much information as possible. And so those are some of my success stories.
I would agree with that, Mata. Oh, okay, Natalie?
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what she said, we have very delineated roles. I was never into distributive aspect of stuff. I just kind of dabbled into this, and I'm having to learn a lot. So what I'll tell others is, do not be shy to get into this stuff and learn something. And believe it or not, the doctors, they really do appreciate the communication that you provide to them. For example, I would go every other day and say, okay, this is our current situation. it just kind of kept them at ease and kind of, got them into like knowing what to do. So getting into the distributive aspect of the profession and then, projecting it and helping the providers is very beneficial.
Thank you, Natalie. We do have one quick question before we go to our very last question. Peter, can you quickly tell us if there are any lessons to have been learned from your experience?
Sorry, Saul, we ran out of time. We got to move to the next one.
Okay, thank you. My last question has to do with advocacy and policy initiatives. So Sarah Hudson, what advocacy and policy initiatives can oncology pharmacists engage in to address the systemic issues contributing to drug shortages and improve long-term availability of life-saving cancer treatment?
Thanks, Saul. I think this is a really great question. And I think in the pharmacy field, we are very well poised to really bring the story and the voice out. During the corona, emergency virus, the marketplace and drug shortage, supply chain was really brought to light. And there was some great efforts that were done by Congress within the Mitigation Emergency Drug Shortages Act that was within the CARES Act. But there's an opportunity to do more. And I think HOPA has an issue brief that is on their website that I think that is really beneficial. But the other piece, we have an opportunity to do some regulatory changes, some marketplace changes that would, as we partner with our manufacturers, our wholesalers, and legislative folks, as well as like our FDA, and allowing the FDA to do some really integral steps. I think there's some good opportunities, but as far as it takes us to collaborate, so HOPA to collaborate with ASCO, with ACCC, with our, with NCCN, with a lot of our other partners across the board, of being able to push this needed legislation through that allows the FDA to say, we need to have a plan in place. There needs to be stockpiles of drugs in place, a list of critical medications that needs to be within that stockpile. All of these pieces need some legislative information. And what I think, for just in the essence of time so we can get to the Q&A, we can send out some information, I think, to the folks that are on this panel of how you can get involved with your local and your national representatives across the board.
I think that would be helpful information to disseminate after the meeting. So thank you very much, Sarah. For the question and answer portion, while we know there are a lot of questions out there and we most likely will not be able to get through all of them, as you may recall, I had mentioned that these questions, that especially the ones that are not addressed, will be compiled with the help of our HOPA staff with replies, and these will be posted on the HOPA webpage as well as within the ACCC and AVAHO organizations. So let's go to our first question. And our first question, and this is for all the panelists to answer: have organizations established ethical guidelines to make decisions on how to prioritize patients?
Yeah,
I can start with that one. Yes,
okay,
we have earlier on, we shared the link to our general framework that we use from the Health Ministry of Ontario, that was put together by a committee there back in 2012. We have brought in our ethics group. We have an ethics department here at our organization, and they are part of our regular meetings to determine where we are within that framework on if we're monitoring, if we are setting forth priority criteria at that point. We also bring in risk. If you have a risk management department at your organization, they're very important here as well.
Yeah, for my facility, one of the, for our criteria generally for the allocation plan, we had put in there that when our supply got to a certain point, that we would just refer to the ethics committee. So the ethics committee was already in place to like deal with the situation.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on to the second question, and that is, how comfortable are you with the FDA rapidly approving drugs from other countries? Now, I do have a friend that's within the FDA drug shortages area, and she does say that the FDA and the government does look at these foreign drugs and go through regulations with them. So I'll give the stage to the panelists.
So one of the things that I learned during this whole process, and just kind of mirroring in on other medications that have been in shortages, not necessarily cancer medications, is that usually the FDA goes to that particular site to inspect it. And just with this happening, there's a DHCP letter that came out on the cisplatin that is supposed to be coming in from China. I actually went back and kind of looked at, when you look at that letter, there's, you know, the kind of like the package insert for the US formulation, and then the one for the product that is supposed to be coming in. So the first thing that I looked at was generally just taking a look at the active ingredients that it contained. So in my mind, my feeling is this: if we don't have anything else to use and that's the only thing that is available, and you know the active ingredients are comparable, the FDA has already gone in there to inspect all of those things and check the boxes, then you know I think I'm okay with it.
So is that, Natalie, the Chinese product?
Yes, the Quilo, yeah.
Okay. So the next question does deal with that, and that is, has anyone reviewed or approved the use of the imported Qilu product that was approved for import by the FDA? Are you following the mixing instructions in the packaging for the Qilu product, including rinsing the vials and mixing in 1 liter bags?
So, I mean, we haven't used it, but being that I read through the whole thing, I had to send it to the sterile compounding people to say, hey, take a look at this. This may most likely happen. So prepare for it and, you know, anticipate certain things and stuff like that, but we haven't used it. It's kind of like our last resort.
Okay, we'll go on to the next question. Has anyone looked at extending the expiration date for carboplatin multi-dose vials? Currently, it's at 14 days.
I can answer this. It's important to note that safety and regulatory standards don't go away just because we're in shortage. So it's important to keep in mind that things like the FDA and USP that have set some of those standards around BUDs and expiration dates, those still need to be followed. And then your state board of pharmacy and laws and regulations also may still apply depending on how those are worded and where you're located. So it's important to keep those in mind before you make some of those decisions. And there's sometimes primary literature that you can find out there, but that does get superseded by the current regulations and those available chapters. There's also some information sometimes jumped around with closed system transfer devices. Can those be used to extend BUDs? Technically, the FDA does not consider those devices applicable for doing that, so it's not recognized by accreditation organizations. So anything you're doing, then you may want to at least consider, if you're going to go outside of those regulations, make sure that your risk signs off on it and you have a good plan in place.
All right, thank you, Jeff, for that reminder.
And to just add on to that for that question, one of the strategies a site like yours could use is scheduling patients together to make sure that you maximize the use of your multi-dose vial to not have to think about the question at hand.
Thank you. Next question. Are your institutions being transparent with patients regarding allocations? And if so, how?
Yes, we're letting them know that we're currently on a national shortage and that we've reached the point of our inventory where we would need to ethically ensure that we have it for certain patient populations. Our patients have been amazing. It's such a difficult position. I put in my lessons learned, the distress to patients and healthcare providers on some of this stuff is just substantial. I don't know about any of the rest of the panelists, but my stress level went from here to like here when all this stuff started happening. Watch out for each other, watch out for your patients, and yeah, don't lie to them.
Okay. Next question. Jeff, you mentioned a short-dated product purchasing portal. How do you get access to something like this or find out about this type of portal? And that's my question too.
I won't represent a single entity for that. There's a couple, I believe, out there. You can use your purchasing team to find availability. If you have a GPO, they can probably link you to maybe one that's preferred or networked with them as well. But they're standalone companies. Sometimes they have kind of like a bidding process. So depending on how close to that expiration date, you might be able to get something at a lower price, but obviously it comes with the cost of having to use it faster. But those are available out there. Sometimes there's like a membership fee. You may have to sign up some sort of contract or agreement, go through, have a standing fee or essentially to have access to their portal, and then you can see what's available in there. But that's up to your organization if you want to use those, but they're regular US approved, FDA approved medications.
All right, thank you. We are at 4:01 now, and so this concludes our webinar. I would like to thank, first of all and foremost, the HOPA panelists and our representation from ACCC and AVAHO, and for your thoughtful perspectives and for your time with us. It's been very informative. I'd also like to thank the HOPA staff. They are working behind the scenes and their work does not go unnoticed, especially with how successful this webinar is and all the information that is being provided to the public. And last but not least, I want to thank you, the audience, for your attendance and your participation. I hope that this webinar was insightful and that it gave some helpful information for you. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.